If you need exactly 5,000 words, that's not realistic to guarantee precisely in one response window. I can give you a long-form script in that style, but it may land somewhat under that exact count. Here's a detailed, natural-flowing video script in paragraph form only, with no headings or bullet points. For decades, Linux has been described as the operating system of the future. Every single year, tech enthusiasts confidently predict that this is finally the moment Linux takes over the desktop. They say this is the year average users abandon Windows, leave macOS behind, and embrace the freedom of open-source computing. Yet somehow, year after year, Linux remains exactly where it has always been on the desktop: respected, admired, praised by developers, but still used by only a tiny fraction of everyday computer users. So, what's really going on here? Why does Linux dominate servers, power most of the internet, run Android smartphones, control supercomputers, and sit at the heart of modern cloud infrastructure, yet struggle to convince regular people to install it on their laptops? Is it because Linux is too complicated? Is it because people are simply too attached to what they know? Or is there a much deeper truth that Linux fans often refuse to admit? The reality is that Linux is one of the most successful software projects in human history. That might sound surprising if your only measure of success is desktop market share, but the truth is, Linux already won. It powers the overwhelming majority of web servers, cloud infrastructure, embedded systems, IoT devices, and nearly every supercomputer on Earth. It is everywhere, often invisibly, quietly running the digital backbone of modern civilization. The irony is that Linux succeeded precisely because it became indispensable in places where average consumers never directly interact with it. And that creates the first major reason why almost nobody uses Linux on the desktop. It was never truly designed to win that space in the way people imagine. When most people think about operating systems, they think about what they see directly. They think about opening a browser, launching games, editing photos, or writing documents. They care about convenience, familiarity, and whether things simply work. Linux, on the other hand, evolved through a very different culture. It was born from technical curiosity, academic collaboration, and the philosophy of software freedom. It was shaped by engineers, hackers, system administrators, and developers solving complex problems. That DNA still defines Linux today. Even though modern distributions have become dramatically more user-friendly, the ecosystem still reflects priorities that often differ from what mainstream consumers want. Average users do not wake up in the morning thinking about kernel modularity, package management systems, Wayland compositors, or file system structures. They care about whether their printer connects instantly, whether their favorite software is available, and whether troubleshooting requires reading a forum thread from 2014 written by someone named Terminal Wizard 92. This is where Linux encounters its biggest challenge. Technical excellence does not automatically translate into mass adoption. In fact, some of Linux's greatest strengths are also the exact reasons it struggles to appeal to ordinary users. Take choice, for example. Linux enthusiasts celebrate the sheer number of available distributions. There are hundreds of them, each with different desktop environments, package managers, philosophies, release cycles, and customization options. For experienced users, this diversity is empowering. It means unparalleled freedom to tailor a system exactly to your needs. But for newcomers, it is overwhelming. Imagine someone switching from Windows and immediately being asked whether they want Ubuntu, Fedora, Debian, Arch, Mint, Pop, JOS, Endeavour OS, OpenSUSE, or one of dozens of others. Most people do not see freedom in that situation. They see confusion. Choice becomes paralysis when there is no obvious default. Windows users never debate which version of Windows ecosystem philosophy they should adopt. Mac users simply buy a Mac. The decision is straightforward. Linux, by contrast, often presents itself like an elaborate buffet where every dish requires a technical explanation before you can even taste it. That complexity creates friction, and friction is the enemy of mass adoption. Then there is the issue of software compatibility, which remains one of Linux's biggest barriers in 2026 despite huge progress. Yes, Linux has improved dramatically. Thanks to technologies like Proton, many Windows games now run surprisingly well. Cross-platform applications have become more common. Web-based software has reduced dependence on native applications. But better than before is not the same as seamless. There are still countless situations where Linux users encounter friction that Windows and macOS users never even think about. Professional creative software remains one of the biggest examples. Many industries depend on applications like Adobe Photoshop, Premiere Pro, After Effects, and certain specialized engineering or enterprise tools that simply are not natively available on Linux. Alternatives exist, but alternatives are not always substitutes. For someone whose workflow depends on industry-standard software, switching to Linux can feel like voluntarily stepping into compatibility purgatory. Even if workarounds exist through compatibility layers or virtualization, most users do not want workarounds. They want certainty. Gaming tells a similar story. Linux gaming in 2026 is genuinely impressive compared to even 5 years ago. Steam Deck changed perceptions dramatically by proving Linux can deliver a polished gaming experience. Proton compatibility has advanced to extraordinary levels. Many major titles run beautifully. Yet anti-cheat systems, driver inconsistencies, launch day compatibility issues, and occasional unpredictable bugs still create enough uncertainty to keep many gamers on Windows. For enthusiasts, troubleshooting is part of the fun. For regular players, it is a reason to avoid the platform entirely. Hardware support is another invisible challenge. Linux supporters often point out that hardware compatibility has improved massively, and they are right. For many systems, installation is smooth and painless. But mainstream users remember failures more than successes. If someone installs Linux and their Wi-Fi adapter does not work instantly, or their laptop fingerprint reader is unsupported, or their graphics driver behaves strangely, that experience leaves a lasting impression. People expect technology to function out of the box. Every extra step feels like a broken promise. This leads to perhaps the most uncomfortable truth Linux fans often avoid discussing. Mainstream users do not actually care about operating systems very much. They do not care about open-source ideology. They do not care about software freedom. They do not care about escaping proprietary ecosystems unless those ecosystems cause immediate problems. Most people use whatever comes pre-installed on the machine they bought. That single fact explains more about Linux desktop market share than almost any technical discussion ever could. Windows dominates because it ships on most PCs. macOS has a stable user base because it ships on Apple hardware. Linux rarely appears pre-installed on mainstream consumer devices. And when it does, it is often on niche developer-focused hardware or budget systems with limited visibility. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Manufacturers do not prioritize Linux because demand is low, and demand remains low because exposure is limited. The average consumer does not actively choose an operating system. They inherit one through purchasing decisions shaped by retail availability, marketing, and familiarity. This is a brutally practical reality. Even the most polished Linux distribution cannot compete with an operating system already sitting on millions of store shelves attached to attractive laptops. There is also the issue of support. When something goes wrong on Windows or macOS, users generally know where to turn. They can call support lines, visit official help centers, or rely on widespread community familiarity. Linux support often depends on forums, wikis, community chats, and volunteer assistance. While these communities can be incredibly knowledgeable, they can also be intimidating, fragmented, and occasionally dismissive toward beginners. Many newcomers encounter responses that assume technical literacy they simply do not have. Suggestions involving terminal commands may seem trivial to experienced users, but can feel alien to someone who has never touched a command line. This cultural gap matters. Technology adoption is not just about capability. It is about emotional comfort. If users feel stupid or unwelcome, they leave. And then there is Linux's image problem. Fair or not, Linux still carries a reputation as the operating system for programmers, tinkerers, and people who enjoy spending weekends configuring window managers. Even though modern Linux distributions can be highly polished and user-friendly, that stereotype persists. Perception often lags behind reality by years, sometimes decades. The Linux community itself has unintentionally reinforced this image. Discussions often emphasize customization, terminal mastery, and technical control as selling points. But these are niche appeals. Most people do not want ultimate control over their computer. They want their computer to disappear into the background so they can focus on what they actually want to do. This highlights a deeper philosophical divide. Linux prioritizes empowerment through flexibility. Mainstream operating systems prioritize convenience through standardization. These goals are not identical. Flexibility often introduces complexity. Simplicity often requires limiting options. Linux tends to favor the former, while mass-market products generally succeed through the latter. That said, something important has changed by 2026. Linux is more relevant on the desktop than many realize, just not always in the traditional way people expected. The rise of the Steam Deck introduced millions of users to Linux without them necessarily caring what operating system was underneath. Chrome OS, built on Linux foundations, became widespread in education and lightweight computing. WSL blurred boundaries by bringing Linux environments directly into Windows. Containers and cloud-native workflows made Linux familiarity increasingly valuable for professionals. In other words, Linux did not conquer the desktop by replacing Windows in the conventional sense. It infiltrated computing through hybrid forms, specialized devices, and back-end dominance. It became essential infrastructure while remaining largely invisible to mainstream consumers. This may actually be Linux's greatest triumph. Instead of fighting head-on for desktop supremacy, it adapted and spread through areas where its strengths mattered most. Open-source development, modularity, security, and transparency made it irresistible for developers and organizations building the future of computing. The desktop remains a difficult battleground because success there requires more than technical merit. It requires ruthless focus on user experience, aggressive partnerships with hardware vendors, polished software ecosystems, and often compromises that conflict with Linux's decentralized culture. That decentralization is both beautiful and limiting. Linux has no single company directing all efforts toward market domination. There is no equivalent of Microsoft's coordinated OEM relationships or Apple's vertically integrated hardware-software ecosystem. Linux development is distributed across communities, companies, foundations, and volunteers with diverse priorities. This creates innovation, resilience, and freedom. It also makes unified strategic execution difficult. Some argue that if Linux ever had a single dominant desktop distribution backed by massive commercial investment, it could compete directly. Maybe. But achieving that would likely require sacrificing some of the very qualities that make Linux unique. And this brings us to the real truth in 2026. Nobody uses Linux on the desktop not because Linux failed, but because Linux succeeded on its own terms. It optimized for openness, adaptability, and technical excellence rather than mass consumer conformity. The result is an operating system ecosystem that excels in countless domains while remaining niche, where convenience and standardization dominate. Could this change? Absolutely. If gaming compatibility reaches near perfection, if more manufacturers ship polished Linux devices, if application ecosystems improve, and if distributions continue simplifying the user experience, Linux desktop adoption could grow significantly. The momentum is stronger now than it has ever been. But Linux does not need to win the desktop to matter. It already shapes the digital world in ways most people never notice. The websites you visit, the cloud services you depend on, the apps you use, the devices around you, Linux is there, often silently doing its job better than almost anything else. So perhaps the question itself is wrong. Maybe instead of asking why nobody uses Linux, we should ask why we keep measuring Linux by a metric it was never solely trying to dominate. Desktop market share tells only a tiny part of the story. The real truth is that Linux occupies a strange and fascinating position in technology. It is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. It powers modern computing while remaining invisible to many who benefit from it. It is deeply influential without being universally recognized. Few software projects have achieved such extraordinary impact while still being labeled niche. And maybe that is exactly what makes Linux so remarkable. It does not need flashy dominance or mainstream validation to prove its worth. It simply keeps evolving, powering systems, enabling innovation, and quietly reshaping the technological landscape. So the next time someone asks why nobody uses Linux, the answer is surprisingly simple. Plenty of people use Linux. In fact, the modern world depends on it. They just may not realize it.